History here at Ohio State University. I am Peter Hahn. I'm currently privileged to serve as chair of the History Department, and it's my genuine pleasure to welcome each and every one of you this afternoon. The purpose of the Goldberg Lecture Series is to provide a forum that advances discussion about the importance of teaching to the health and vigor of Ohio's system of higher education. And we are confident that our speaker today, Mr. Norm Augustine, will deliver an insightful lecture. Before the formal introduction of our speaker, allow me to share briefly that the lecture series is named in honor of Professor Harvey Goldberg, a legendary professor of history here from 1950 to 1962, who not only educated his students, but also inspired them. More than a decade ago, a group of Harvey students memorialized him with a foundational gift that helped us establish the Harvey Goldberg Center for Excellence in Teaching. Under the leadership of its very capable director, Dr. David Staley, that center has emerged as a cornerstone of the History Department's initiatives to promote innovative and effective teaching, not only in the department, but across the university, and increasingly across the state of Ohio and beyond. If anyone's interested in learning more about the Goldberg Center and its many missions, I encourage you to contact Dr. Staley or me at any time. And now I am privileged to call forward Susan S. Williams, Vice Provost for Academic Policy and Faculty Resources. Before her current appointment, Dr. Williams pursued a distinguished career at Ohio State as a faculty member in the Department of English, where she won both the Alumni Award for Distinguished Teaching and the Faculty Award for Distinguished University Service. Educated at Yale and a specialist in 19th century American literature and culture, Dr. Williams has published 4 books, and in 2008 she was elected an honorary member of the American Antiquarian Society. Please join me in welcoming to this podium Dr. Susan Williams.
Thank you, Peter, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of President Gee and Provost DeLuto, and indeed the entire university community, I'm honored to welcome and introduce Mr. Norman R. Augustine as today's guest speaker in the Harvey Goldberg Lecture. I think it's safe to say that he has earned his keep today because this is actually, as I understand it, his second lecture of the day. Just this morning, he presented the keynote address at the 2012 Public and Land Grant University Conference on Energy Challenges, the next 50 years. There are a lot of challenges ahead, I think. And the fact that he can give 2 lectures in the same day on rather disparate topics, I think means that we've got a really great afternoon ahead of us. I think knowing a bit about the breadth and depth of his interests will help explain how he can give 2 such disparate, or in his mind related, lectures on the same day. He started his education at Princeton, where he graduated with a bachelor's degree in aeronautical engineering and also earned a master's degree in engineering. And eventually he returned to teach at Princeton, and I think we'll probably hear some about that today. In between his college and then returning to Princeton to teach, he did a number of things. His early career as an engineer led him to Douglas Aircraft Company, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and LTV Missiles and Space Company. Later he served as the undersecretary of the Army, and then as the president of Lockheed Martin, in which he retired as chairman and CEO. Mr. Augustine has served on the United States President's Council on Advisors on Science and Technology during both Democratic and Republican administrations, and his counsel has been sought on a wide range of science and technology matters throughout his career. And this continues. I noted that just last July, the National Science Foundation announced that he would lead an upcoming strategic review of U.S. science-supported operations in Antarctica. In addition to his career in engineering and public service, Mr. Augustine has given fully and generously of his time to an amazing array of public and private sector organizations, including serving as chairman and principal officer of the American Red Cross and as chairman of the Council of the National Academy of Engineering. He's also served as a member of the Board of Trustees at Colonial Williamsburg and as a regent of the University System of Maryland and as a trustee emeritus both of Johns Hopkins University and also a former member of the Board of Trustees at Princeton and at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He's also a fellow of the National Academy of Arts and Sciences, holds 27 honorary degrees, and received the National Medal of Technology and Innovation, along with the likes of the inventor of the implantable pacemaker, the Polaroid land camera, and people, well, we all know, like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates. In In addition, Who's Who in America and the Library of Congress selected him as one of 50 great Americans. He's also written 4 books, and the one that I was most interested in hearing about is called Shakespeare in Charge, The Bard's Guide to Leading and Succeeding on the Business Stage. As an English professor, I want to know more about that. He's also written a lot in the public press about education and innovation, and I noted in particular a piece in Forbes magazine last year that he entitled Danger, America is Losing Its Edge in Innovation. And in that article, he talked a little bit about his interest in teaching, which I think we're going to hear more about today, and the fact that he took early retirement from the aerospace industry to follow that dream of teaching, and first met a barrier that turned out to be an unexpected opportunity. The barrier was that, as I understand it, he wanted to teach 8th grade in math in your state and was deemed unqualified to do so, but then could be welcomed to the faculty at Princeton and teach there. And I also understand that the Princeton undergraduate newspaper ranked the course that he taught there as one of 10 that every undergraduate should take. We all know how hard that is to achieve. So this is a very accomplished speaker. We're really glad to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about education and humanities and how all the other experiences that you want to bring to bear on what you're talking about today. So welcome to the podium, a truly Renaissance individual, Norm Augustine.
Thank you, and it's so nice to be here, and that was a wonderful introduction. I told a story this morning, which I wasn't going to tell now, but it's so befitting that those of you who were there this morning will forgive me, perhaps. Your introduction was so nice, it reminded me of my very first day on the faculty at Princeton, and I spent my entire life up until that time either in government or in industry. And I was asked to give the welcoming lecture to the incoming freshman engineers. The dean was making his opening remarks. I wasn't paying much attention to what he was saying. Then all of a sudden I heard him say, and now we will hear from Professor Augustine. And as I said this morning, this is a true story that just for an instant it flashed through my mind. Geez, what a coincidence. They've got some guy here by the same name. But perhaps more appropriate, I am reminded of an introduction of my friend David Broderick from the business world. David was, of course, chairman of U.S. Steel in the glory days, and David was being introduced by someone who said that David was one of America's most gifted business persons. And to prove it, the person who introduced him cited just one simple example. He said that David had made $10 million in California oil. And when David came to the podium, it was very evident that he was uneasy, or he was a little embarrassed. He said that the introduction had been essentially accurate, except that it had not been California, it was Pennsylvania. And actually it wasn't oil, it was coal. And it wasn't 10 million, it was 10,000. It wasn't he, it was his brother. And he didn't make it, he lost it. So we're on a roll here today. And I do appreciate the plug for my books. I always say that if any of you happen to have a copy of any of them, let me congratulate you on being a member of a very select small group. Meg Whitman, when she was running eBay, told me that one of the most sought after collector's items on eBay are unsigned copies of my books. Life is difficult. Whatever the case, I'm honored to be here at this great university today. In fact, I'm doubly honored, given both this morning and this afternoon. And certainly this morning we're talking about the Morrill Act and just how far this institution has come from its days as the Ohio Agricultural and Mechanical College. And to be able to have a topic like this and a group like this speaks to that evolution. And of course, my friend John Ong here, who I have many friends here at this university, and he's one of the treasured ones. And John, thank you for being here today. Having heard me before, I especially thank you for being here today. I should note perhaps that my own roots are in Ohio. When my family, a bit of history, when my family came to the United States in 1834 from Elbending in Germany, they settled in Ohio. And then in the mid-1890s, they moved to Colorado, where I was born. And my sense of honor at being invited to deliver this fourth Goldberg Lecture is somewhat moderated by my lack of credentials to speak on a subject related to history to an audience of great historians. I am an engineer. I'm one of those people who designed your computer so that when you want to shut it off, you click on start. Makes a lot of sense to me. I don't know about you. But, on the other hand, my career in engineering has had its bright spots, one of which was that I met my wife of now 50 years when I was in engineering school, and she only recently told me that the odds were good, but the goods were odd. Whatever the case, my only claim is that I am fascinated by history, I love history, and I also think history is important, and that's what I really would like to talk about. But also that I've learned a great deal from reading history and trying to study history in a more or less serious manner. One can certainly debate what all is included in history. What is the footprint of history? You know, does history just apply to nations, or does it apply maybe to corporations or to people? I had a history written of our corporation, which sent one to every employee and every retiree, and I got more wonderful letters back, mostly complaining that we hadn't included the part that they were involved in. But it was a wonderful thing to do the history. It had one other negative thing, and that was that I wanted to issue it on the 75th anniversary of our company. And when the historians got digging into it, it turned out our 75th anniversary had been the year before I started to do this. We were celebrating the wrong year all this time. History, of course, doesn't repeat itself, but it's been said to rhyme. I believe that is true. And what I guess I'd like to start with in this audience is a little quiz. And some of you, if you've been reading the Wall Street Journal, which there's no reason you would, but if you have been, I had a little piece in there. I began by pointing out or asking the question, in what subject do American students perform the worst? Is it in science, in economics, in history, in math? Those are the four choices, and the answer turns out to be in history, a very disappointing result. And I'm sure many of you have suffered the pain of watching Jay Leno on the Tonight Show go out on the street and start asking people really obvious questions about history and finding they had absolutely no idea. And with him trying to give them every hint in the world, they couldn't come up with the right answer. Sadly, there have been a series of tests not too long ago of graduates of many of America's more prestigious institutions, including this one, where they were asked questions about history, failed abysmally as a nation. It turned out that, I can't remember the percentage, I think like 20% of the people knew that Madison had something to do with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. On the other hand, I think it was 91% knew who Snoop Doggy was. That's the sort of a challenge I think we face, and that one sort of has to ask why that might be the case. That leads me to a confession, and the confession is that when I was in high school, I didn't like history. When I was in college, I therefore avoided history to the extent I could. I studied engineering at a liberal arts school where engineers were viewed as something maybe somewhere between a plumber and a carpenter. But fortunately, they made us take courses on the other side of the street there. And to our great good fortune, many of us became fond of what we were exposed to. On the other hand, when I was in high school, I must confess, I never really did understand why it was important to me that Napoleon was born on August 5th in 1769. To this day, I'm still trying to figure out why that's important to me. And I'll bet many of you in this room didn't know that, and many of you probably didn't care. It's certainly hard to work into a conversation at a cocktail party on this stuff. On the other hand, I'll also bet that nobody here knows that today, this very day, is von Ribbentrop's birthday. And once again, why would I have had to memorize that in high school, and why would anyone care? And I'm sure you've heard that complaint given over and over. Well, if I started out with that tepid feeling towards history and the study of history, what happened? Was it a fantastic instructor, as is often the case, who caused me to see the light? Honesty requires that I say that wasn't the situation in my personal case. In my case, my love of history began when, during summer jobs while I was in high school and college, spreading tar on the roofs of the buildings in Denver, Colorado. As you can see, my career in business started at the very top, so to speak. And we had a roofing gang whose job was every day to go out and spread tar. And it turns out when you're spreading tar, you have lots of time to think. It's kind of forward and backward all day. You go north and south or east and west. That's your only decision to be made. This roofing gang consisted of 8 fellows who were professional tar spreaders, a nice group of guys. I mean that in all sincerity. Some of whom I still know and see. But there were 2 of us in the summer that were augmentees, amateur tar spreaders, so to speak. And the other one, by chance, was a history major at Columbia University. He was a senior at the time, one of the years I was working on the roof, and roofs. And he really, I think, for a senior in college, understood history and was passionate about it. And as we would spread tar side by side, there'd be silence for 20, 30 minutes, and all of a sudden he would turn to me. If it were today, he might say, did you know that if an asteroid hadn't impacted the Earth 62 million years ago, we wouldn't be here because the dinosaurs that would have lived would have eaten us? And that would lead to a conversation that would go on all morning about how you got from 62 million years ago to my being eaten on that roof by a dinosaur. And I discovered a great fascination in all these unusual things and how he was able to weave them together. He'd say, if Rosa Parks had chosen a different seat on that bus, how do you suppose America would differ today? Great question. I mean, that's good for 2 days on the top of the roof. You think about it. He had all these sort of, but for the want of a nail, the kingdom was lost sorts of questions that he would ask. You know, did you know that when an archduke was shot in some third-rate country, it started a world war? And I became fascinated with these stories, so fascinated that a couple of years ago, I had to build a new garage on my house because my garage was so full of history books and biographies that I didn't have room for a cart. And even today, when I get new history books, I pile them on my bedstand, and I can collect them faster than I can read them. I hope I'll live a long life. My mother lived to be 105 and Dad 96, so I've got a shot at this. But I collected the books, and eventually they would hit the lamp on the bedstand. Then my wife takes them all and puts them somewhere. I don't know where she puts them, but she puts them somewhere. Well, to me, history became something that was exciting, it was real, and I could never understand why everyone didn't have that same love for history, particularly some of the people I worked with, who I think it would have served very well, and I'll come back to that a little bit. But because of this, when I go on business trips, if I have a free weekend and there's a historical site nearby, which there almost always is, instead of sitting in a bar, I go visit somewhere. My most recent visit was to Waterloo, where I'd never been before. And I had a great guide who walked me around the battlefield. First thing I learned was that the Battle of Waterloo didn't occur at Waterloo, so you learn all these interesting little things. This led me to have a fascination with travel, to see historical sites. I've traveled to 111 countries now, and places that, why would anybody want to go? I've been to Timbuktu and taken a boat up the Irrawaddy, and took a 23-day train ride across the Silk Route, which is a real experience, particularly if you happen to do it and be on the border of Afghanistan on 9/11, when history sort of comes together. And my top priority right now for a trip I'd like to take is the Khyber Pass, but that's not looking too good at the moment. But the study of history, I think, has such a great impact on one's reasoning skills, on the ability to think analytically, to think logically, and particularly to think critically. And that's such an important part of life, and an especially important part of business, is to be able to think critically. And also the ability to connect cause and effect. and effect and cause is an important part of what I found we were doing in government and business during my years there. I found that many of the most successful business people are ones who can connect the big picture, the pieces of the big picture, even when some of the parts are missing, which is often the case in trying to understand history. So many questions that instead of memorizing dates, if in the teaching of history we say, for example, what if Lee Harvey Oswald had missed? How might the world be different today? Or would Syria be relatively quiet today had it not been for a couple of teenagers who wrote graffiti on a wall? Or would Tunisia, and Libya, and Yemen, and so on have imploded had it not been for a squabble between a street vendor and a business person? And all these questions, I think, are not only fascinating, but one can learn from them. And so I arrive at the conclusion that when teaching history, it's so much more important to focus on the why than on the what. And obviously, you have to understand the what. If you don't know what happened, you'll never understand why it happened. But too often we spend our time about what happened and we don't go into the why, and it's the why that's probably the most fascinating part. Also, if we could teach history not as a series of isolated events, but as an interlocking flow of events that takes place and they influence each other. It's a little like the difference, I think, between listening to isolated musical notes and listening to a symphony, if you will. In that regard, I have a friend, Walter Alvarez, who his father was a Nobel laureate. As a matter of fact, he got his Nobel Prize for figuring out what happened to the dinosaurs. But Walter teaches, and he teaches, he's a geologist, I think, but he teaches a course in big history. And his definition of history is big. And he starts out in this course on big history with the major events that have impacted our lives today. And he starts out 14.7 billion years ago with the Big Bang. And then he goes to the advent of the appearance of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago, and the appearance of life on the Earth shortly after that, strikingly shortly after that. Humans on the planet 200,000 years ago, and farming, and so on, fast forwarding to nuclear weapons and the Apollo program and the most recent election. And obviously, as you get closer today, the density of events begins to become greater. And it's one of the most popular courses at the university where he teaches. He's now putting this on the web to where you can go in at any one of the events, the Great Depression, and click on it. It'll keep taking you down further and further if you want to know more about the Great Depression. But the thing he tries to do is to weave together the relationship between all of these various things. So, as an example, how much better would it be in teaching about the end of World War II to ask the students, if you were Truman and were told about the atomic bomb, would you have used it, and why? And how would you have used it, and why, if you were to have used it? That causes people to really think, the kind of thinking one needs to have when you face tough questions. Nothing as tough as that, but difficult questions in life and in the business world. In terms of my fascination for history, an event that really stands out in my mind occurred a few years ago. I think it was mentioned, I was on the Board of Trustees of Colonial Williamsburg. And I happened to be in Williamsburg. It was a fall evening, it was raining, it was cool and dark, and there were leaves everywhere. And I was supposed to meet a friend in the Capitol building there. They had opened for us so we could meet there. And I got there early, and my friend got there late, as it turned out. But I went on into the Capitol building and took a seat by myself, I thought, in the darkness. And there was candlelight flickering, as it would have been in the colonial times. And then suddenly I saw somebody, a silhouette against the window, even though it was dark outside, there were lanterns. I saw a silhouette stand up and someone began to walk toward me, and I could see that he was wearing colonial garb. And as he approached me, he said, Mr. Augustine of Maryland, I believe. It turned out it was Thomas Jefferson. And, it was one of the actors who plays the role of Thomas Jefferson. And those folks really know the history of their individuals. I wonder psychologically how this affects them when they go to the grocery store or something, because they live this part intensely. And he came up to me and I introduced myself. He was most pleasant, and we began to visit about current events and things that were going on and had taken place. We talked quite a little bit about, I remember about the little incident involving Hamilton and Burke and different views of that. And somewhere in the course of the discussion, I happened to mention Richard Nixon. And he got this puzzled look and he looked at me and he said, Mr. Nixon, he said, I don't believe I know the gentleman. Which colony is he from? And the whole conversation went on like that. It was absolutely magical. And if we could teach history more along those lines, young people would get excited about it. They would never forget it. And they would learn lessons that they could well apply to other things that they do in life. There are, of course, so many puzzles that come out of history that thinking about them is helpful, I think, in the development of a citizen. Questions like, why is it that Singapore, with no natural resources to speak of, has been generally so much more successful than Malaysia, which has quite a few natural resources? Or how about the comparison between Hong Kong and Macau, or East Berlin and West Berlin? And you could draw all these comparisons. What was it that made the difference? And why might that be important to us, particularly to those of us who live in the nation's capital and have an interest in an involvement in the political sphere? In terms of the business world, I've discovered that the study of history, like the study of English or several other topics, has the great benefit of teaching an individual to write. And in my experience working with engineers, I once had 82,000 of them working for me. And the thing that separated the engineers who kind of moved up and the ones who didn't wasn't their understanding of the second law of thermodynamics. Most of them pretty well understood that, or they wouldn't have been there. It was their ability to write and explain the second law of thermodynamics, or to make a presentation that was at least halfway coherent. And much of that, I think, was not learned in the engineering courses, but was learned in the liberal arts courses they took. But most importantly, I think, is that history helps create informed citizens. And consider just a few rather sobering thoughts in that regard. Your vote could be canceled by the vote of any individual in this nation who's allowed to vote and chooses to vote. And it could be canceled by that individual who never heard of Afghanistan, can't find the United States on a map, doesn't know where Iraq or Iran might be, doesn't care about Pakistan, and no interest in the relationship we have with China. They can cancel your vote out. And if you think that's unimportant, ask Al Gore about that. Or how would you like to be falsely accused of a crime, where your jury consisted of people with no ability to do critical thinking, or no understanding of the idea that you were innocent in this country until you were proven guilty? Or how would you like to have a person representing your nation or your corporation or your university abroad, say in Israel, who had never heard of the Holocaust or knew very little about it? And as far-fetched as that may seem, I'm aware of a case where a U.S. major corporation was seeking to do business with some people in the Chinese People's Republic, hosted a lovely dinner for them, and on each of the tables for a centerpiece had a little flag of the People's Republic of China. Minor inversion of two letters, CPR and PRC, but it's not a great way to promote business in the Chinese People's Republic, I would say. Well, more recently, I think there's a coming together of my fields of engineering and science with the fields of history. And I had the wonderful experience just recently of going down into the inner archives, a friend who oversees that area gave me a little tour at the National Archives building on Constitution Avenue in Washington. And one of the things I saw was the enlistment papers for the first 4 or 5 people to join the Continental Army. Washington's paper was the first one. And the thing that struck me about it, not only did he swear allegiance to the colonial causes, he disavowed any loyalty to the king. Well, that's like signing the certificate of treason. I mean, think of the courage that it took. It was witnessed by another person there, and then he witnessed the next person's paper, and they all signed this. Do we have that kind of courage in our nation today, in our nation's leadership? And maybe if our nation's leadership heard more things like that, and about Lincoln passing the Morrill Act in the midst of a terrible war when we didn't know the nation would survive, was worrying about what our universities would be like years later. I think we could use more of an understanding of what that kind of courage can do. Shortly after having seen these documents, I heard an interesting thing, and this is just in passing, but an acquaintance who is head of the Smithsonian, head of the Library of Congress, told me that they and others in the government have now developed a way that if you have a pad of a book or a pad of paper and you write on the top copy, they now can read what you've written on about the 25th copy down. And so you can be at a meeting and with a book in front of you, and Jefferson can be writing his views of Franklin or whoever on there, and today they can read it, whereas all these years they've not been able to. And that's going to open a lot of very interesting aspects. I think the other exciting thing that's happened in science that impacts history among many things, but are the developments in genomics. Ask Mr. Jefferson about that, I guess. But certainly, in the case of the history of my own family, which I got interested in, I traced it through conventional genealogy terms, which was a lot harder 25 years ago than it is today. I got back to 1575 in a small town, Elmendingen in Germany, near the Black Forest. And today, through the use of genomics and the help of National Geographic, I've been able to trace my family from the other direction, from Tanzania through Iran and Iraq, China, west into Northern Europe, and eventually into Southern Europe, and then back into Germany, where that matches up with where I found them through conventional genealogy. Pretty exciting stuff. And I also learned the enormous impact that environmental change had on where our family was. That might be an important lesson today, because as the glaciers moved down or the glaciers receded, the Sahara turned into a savanna. Everything changed for my ancestors. And I found this to be a fascinating aspect of history, was to understand your personal history, and something else that many students might do, because it's a great detective story is what it is. It's like being a detective. So what is the key then to teaching history effectively? And in my judgment, it is the teacher, just as in any other subject. That's, as the mathematician would say, a necessary but not sufficient condition. Pardon me, but to have a great teacher does make all the difference. As Dr. Williams said, I always wanted to be a teacher. I took early retirement. The company was doing very well. I didn't think it needed me anymore, and so I left, discovered indeed that I wasn't qualified to teach 8th grade mathematics, so even though my minor through a master's degree was in math, at any school in my state, any public school in my state. Unfortunately, my friends at Princeton invited me to come there and teach seniors and graduate students at the engineering school, which I did, and enjoyed it very much. But you have to ask yourself, what's wrong with that picture? And as my friends from Yale, you will appreciate that. They'll say, well, they don't see anything wrong with that picture. Why was I surprised? But to me, it was surprising that you can teach Ivy League school, you can't teach 8th grade math anywhere in Maryland, and probably a lot of other states too. The more I've studied teaching and the likes, I spent a lot of my time since I retired. I work still basically full time, but all pro bono. And I've studied a lot about K through 12 education, And it turns out that almost all my going-in views were wrong. For example, I thought the secret to successful education at the K through 12 level at history or any other subject would be a teacher with a lot of experience, very small classes, very attractive classrooms, a nice study environment, and lots of money. But as I've traveled around the world, I visited all kinds of schools with 60 or 70 children in the classes that do just spectacularly on the international examinations, particularly in China and Korea. In terms of having a lot of money, the United States spends more money per student than all but two countries, Switzerland and Luxembourg. The school district in this country that spends the most per student is the Washington, D.C. school district. The school district in this country that has the worst performance per student is the Washington, D.C. school district. The quality of the physical environment, not too long ago I was in Togo and visited a school there where the desks were all lined up, kind of like you might expect to see in this country, chairs and desks, but they were under a bunch of trees out in the desert, not the desert, but I don't know what you would call it, sparsely treed area. The kids were there studying and working as hard as I've ever seen kids study. So I don't think the quality of the physical environment is a driving factor, and there have been other evidence of that, for example, some in Harlem right now. Then there's the question of teacher experience in K through 12, and it turns out that that's almost a negative correlation in many cases. But what you want is a teacher that is really excited and enthusiastic and loves their field. And teachers who are not well prepared pretty soon burn out, it seems. If a teacher really likes their field, you get a rather different story. I also discovered in my teaching stint that teaching is very, very hard work. I was extremely naive. A couple days before classes started, the chairman of our department stopped by my little office and said he thought I would need a teaching assistant. We didn't have teaching assistants when I was a student, so I didn't know what that was. I said, well, why would I need a teaching assistant? He looked at me and he said, you better have two. Fortunately, he gave me two, and they saved me, absolutely saved me. They were terrific people. I still keep track of them. But in the sense of teaching being hard, and it's ever-changing, things that you might take for granted for my generation, some of your generations, or others, the kids today don't respond to. I'll share with you a little story about that that comes home to me. My grandson's, he was in preschool at the time, which I guess would make him about 4. His teacher learned that I had some involvement in the space program and asked if I would come and give a lecture to the 4-year-olds on the space program. And I mean, this is terrifying stuff. I never spent so much time, literally, on a lecture or a presentation as I did on it. I mean, Harvard, Princeton, and Ohio State are nothing compared to these 4-year-olds, because you give the lecture sitting on the floor with them, and one of them will stand up and say, this is boring, let's go out to the playground. Next thing you know, you're sitting alone on the floor. So I figured I better have a backup plan, and I did, which I didn't share with anybody. And anyway, the lecture went pretty well for quite a while, then it sort of sagged a little bit. And so I called on my backup plan, and asked the children if any of them had ever talked to an astronaut. None of them ever had. I said, well, why don't we call an astronaut on the speakerphone here, and you can all line up and ask questions about astronauting. And they thought that would be a good deal, so all the 4-year-olds lined up, and I called Buzz Aldrin on the phone. And pretty soon the word gets out that Buzz is on the phone, and the other classes start filing in the back of the room. The principal, the office staff are all there. First question was, were you scared? Second question was, how do you go to the bathroom in those suits? And it went on from there. The questions were great, and Buzz did a spectacular job of answering these children's questions very meaningfully. I might even say inspiringly. And it was a great success. I was thrilled. The teacher had told somebody that I later learned that it was the best day of her teaching career. And the problem, or the thing started to unravel that evening when these little children go home, and they got the first question the little children get when they go home, of course. What do you do at school today? Well, after the parents had talked to each other that evening and the email went back and forth, I learned the following day that the children all thought they were talking to Buzz Lightyear. They had not heard of Buzz Aldrin. I couldn't believe this. It was really quite frightening. So what did I learn from all this? One thing, what is it does make a great teacher? One is a deep knowledge of their own field. That sounds not terribly profound. You may know that 32% of the history teachers in the U.S. public schools don't have a degree and certificate in history. It's often a phys ed teacher who's told to go teach history. So you need a teacher that understands their field. That's particularly troublesome where I live because math and science teachers, instead of being 32%, is 69 and 93% don't have degrees in their field. Secondly is extended class time. In the United States today, young people spend 1,456 hours a year watching TV and playing video games. They spend 1,080 hours in a classroom. Yet if you're on a school board, the quickest way to get kicked off is to propose extending the class year by 2 hours. You're a goner. And the last thing that I learned that is really important, so one is a teacher qualified in their field. The second is a teacher who's really excited and enthusiastic. The number of years experience don't matter that much. The third is time in class. The fourth is parental interest. And that's hard to induce, but we may have to learn how somehow. At the college level, I worry a great deal today because the impact of budget cuts on our great universities, particularly our great public universities that educate most of the people that grow up in our nation. I also worry about an imbalance, particularly in the science fields, but perhaps elsewhere, between teaching and research. And the emphasis put on getting tenure based on research and papers written as opposed to being a great teacher. It seems to me both are important. And I think it's that combination that made our universities the finest universities in the world. I'd like to close with a history lesson I was given that I will never forget. It occurred not all that long ago. I was visiting in what was Eastern Europe, behind the Iron Curtain, one of the countries. And I had an appointment with the president of that country who was an academic. He had a PhD, and he had spent most of his adult years under the communists in jail for political crimes. And when the wall came down, he of course was freed, and eventually he ran for president of his country and became president of his country. And I was aware of this history when I went to see him. And he was a very quiet man, very tall. And when we met, I was so struck with the building we went in. It was one of these classic European stone buildings with carved stone, beautiful walnut paneling, all carved, beautiful. And so to kind of open the conversation, I mentioned how magnificent his building was. And I said, it certainly makes our White House look modest. And he turned to me and he looked at me and he said, Mr. Augustine, he said, the thing that makes your White House great is your Constitution and your Bill of Rights. And I almost cried, literally, when I heard somebody who spent his life in prison as a political prisoner have to tell me that, who's lived here all my life. And thank goodness for the people in our history who've given us the kind of world that we have the opportunity to live in, and hopefully the kind of world that we won't mess up. So that's really what I wanted to say. That really is, that experience I had, that's history, that's living history. And it was a great lesson. And I thank you very much for the honor of speaking to you. And again, I hope someday you'll have the courage to invite an engineer back. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for a few questions, and our speaker has agreed to take them, so please. In the back.
I'm standing because I can barely see you through the heads in front of me. On behalf of the historians, I appreciate tremendously your commitment and Street Journal, a readership and an editorial board that actually is in favor of history. How do you recommend that we spread the good word about the importance of studying history? How do you recommend, do you have any recommendations for reinforcing the fact that the humanities and history in particular is worthy of reinforcement and emphasis in the primary, secondary, and collegiate level?
It's a good question, and I guess I better be by the microphone. I think that most of the answer to that is lost by the time when people get to Ohio State University. You probably won't make many converts here. You may make some. And I think that where you have to work to accomplish this awareness of the importance of history and appreciation and love of history, you have to go back to very young children because we lose them fairly early on. And how might you do that? I've thought about that some. In my field, only in recent years, we've discovered that young people lose interest in science by 4th grade. I used to think it was 8th grade or 12th grade, but it's 4th grade. And so what we've been doing, as you may be aware quite energetically, we've got robot clubs, we've got rocket clubs, we've got biology clubs. They meet on Saturday. Faculty members at universities, at high schools, parents who work in those fields put on programs after school, and the kids love it. They absolutely love it. They don't feel the pressure of having to get a grade, and they do exciting, meaningful things. And it seems to me that you could do the same thing with history and gather a group of kids who were excited and interested about learning, but maybe didn't care about history, and pose to them some of these issues and actually simulate the Constitutional Congress and have the children play the roles. And so my bottom line is to have some clubs that meet on weekends and after school at a very young age to try to expose them to the excitement that goes along with history. I don't mean to suggest this is easy, but it takes work, but I think it really will work. Thank you. Okay, yes, in front.
I have a student this quarter who, on the first day of class, told me he was very excited to be in my history class because he had wanted to be an English major and his parents won't let him. Instead, he enjoys the engineering degree he is being forced into, but nonetheless, he is being forced into an engineering degree and away from the humanities. Do you have anything to say about this trend of belittling the humanities, especially really among parents who want their children to succeed in life? And I guess the definitions then of success.
Yeah, well, first of all, my definition of success is to be happy in life and to leave the world a little better than when you found it. And by that standard, I think those parents are making a terrible mistake. And first of all, I know almost no one who's good at something they don't enjoy. And I know a lot of people are good at things they do enjoy. And to encourage somebody to go do something they don't enjoy is almost assuring them of failure, in my opinion. And so I'm saddened that I'm aware of lots of cases like that. I have lots of friends who are physicians because their parents want them to be physicians and they hate it. And I wouldn't go to one of them either. But, you know, what do you do about that? I really don't know. From a global standpoint, there's a bigger problem, and that is the worst of all worlds would be an extremely capable scientist with no understanding of ethics. I mean, that has to be about the worst combination you could think of. And the courses I taught at Princeton, I always had a segment on ethics in them, and I always told the students, this is the price of taking the course. If you don't want to take the piece on ethics, you're in the wrong course. And the first reaction to engineers was that engineers don't face ethical issues. We deal with the laws of nature. And then I would start walking them through an average day of my life when you would trip on ethical issues all day long. And they soon began to feel very differently about it. And so I think not only from the individual standpoint, but from the world standpoint, there's this balance that I argue strongly and devote a lot of time to getting more young people to go into the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math. But I sure don't want them to go into that alone, which I think would be a dreadful mistake. And just to give the other side of this, in this country, 4.4% of our graduates are in engineering, which ranks us 14th from the bottom out of 93 nations in the engineering field. We are underrepresented, and that's not good either. We rank just behind Mozambique and for the fraction of engineers we graduate. But hopefully the ones we graduate are mostly there because they want to be, and that's the key. It's a great question. Thank you.
You talked about the creating the history clubs as an effective way to advocate to children and to get them interested in history. Now, what about advocating to the institutions, the powers that be? What is the most effective way to advocate to powerful figures who are the decision makers who shape the institutions in which we all live, that history is an important subject to teach, to learn, to understand, and to inform our society?
I wish I had a better answer than I have to that question. And unfortunately, for historians to do that is not very effective because you candidly lack the credibility in that field. It's very ironic. I have a book of laws called Augustine's Laws, and one of my laws is that when I go to the Congress and talk about history, I'm given a great deal of credibility even though I don't know anything about it. If I go to the Congress and talk about advanced spacecraft, which I know a little bit about, I'm given no credibility because I live in that world. And my law is the more you know about a topic, the less credible you are. So you don't want to know much about any topic, you'll be very credible. So I think the best thing you could do is to try to get other people who feel like I do to speak out. And if you can get some of your people in the engineering school to speak out about the importance of history, and get some of the people in your business school to speak out about the course of importance of history, then I think you'll have an impact. And there are those people out there. And that would be my suggestion to you.
Thank you.
So I'll hand over here. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how we extract the lessons of history for issues that seem to have no historical precedent? I'm thinking about things like climate change, terrorism, and other things that we're dealing with as a world.
Now that is really a challenging question. I've thought about that, particularly in the context of climate change, where if you think about it, what we're running in today is a grand experiment that we can't control, and we may lose control of. And there are many unknowns in this grand experiment that we're running. And we may be wrong in either direction, but it's a very dangerous thing to be doing. And how do you go back to precedent? One thing I think you can go back to, if you take climate change, is you go to, you're probably aware of it, in Antarctica they've dug ice cores, also in Greenland, where we now have 700,000 years of darn good history of what our atmosphere was like and what the temperature was like. And it's fairly irrefutable data, I believe. And I think we have to rely on that sort of sometimes you can find something. Just an example, a more trivial one, but years ago I was asked to chair a little group when the Japanese semiconductor industry appeared to be taking over the world, to study the history of the Japanese semiconductor industry and what could be learned from it. And we did study it. We learned some lessons, we thought. And I was in the aerospace industry, and when the aerospace industry basically collapsed when the Berlin Wall fell, in 5 years we lost 40% of our employees. That was 700,000 people, jobs, and we lost 2/3 of the companies in our industry. And the company I was with, I got thinking back, and this was uncharted territory for us, But I got thinking back to that little piece of evidence, the Japanese semiconductor industry, and we adopted their strategy. And when we came out of this, we went in as a $4 billion company and came out as a $44 billion company about 6 years later. And so I unashamedly say we borrowed the strategy from studying the history of the Japanese. So I think there are clues out there that you can rely on, but when you get in uncharted waters, I don't have any answers. As my friend who actually was the guy I was supposed to meet at the Capitol of Williamsburg says that if at all possible, try to be lucky. So, we have time for one more. Where do we stand? One more. I saw one question here. I think we've got them all. Well, again, thank you very much for the invitation.
Before you leave, please be sure to stay. Rather than leave, I should say, please feel free to stay and enjoy some refreshments at the back of the room and greet our speaker individually. Thank you very much for coming out on this beautiful afternoon. Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Nice to meet you.